Welcome to Present Perfect. No grammar, but plenty of history. I'm Don Congdon, your host and guide, helping you explore how the past reaches out and touches the present. Today, we take a break from our regular podcast and look at some seasonally appropriate history. Welcome to the 2020 Christmas Special. Christmas has played a major role in the church for much of its history. Yet it's obvious that today's Christmas is an awkward conglomeration of many traditions and secular elements. The atheistic community frequently accuses Christians of promoting myths through Christmas. Unfortunately, they're all too right when they speak of many of our Christmas traditions. Much of what we celebrate and many of our beliefs are neither biblically based nor historically sound. So let's fix that. In this study, we're going to look at some of our Christmas traditions and see where they come from. Unfortunately, as we'll discover, we've been guilty of adding much to the biblical account. Some may be offended at my challenging what they see as harmless, colorful traditions that hurt no one. I'll admit I approach this subject with some trepidation, for it's an emotionally charged one. After all, why should we challenge tradition when it's supposedly just fun, innocuous, and life-enriching? After all, we know the truth, don't we? Real Christians can separate tradition from biblical truth. First of all, I question this last assertion. Traditions can become so deep-rooted that we lose our ability to separate them from the original truth. Secondly, I believe that in our post-Christian culture, non-biblical tradition poses a dangerous problem. While we might argue that a Christian culture can separate truth from tradition, we cannot make this claim for people with little religious background. When we witness to the unsaved, many have almost no conception of Christianity. We can no longer draw upon the standard Sunday school level of education. The unsaved know of Christianity only through secondary sources such as the media, Christmas cards, Christmas programs, music, and religious art. Put yourself into the mind of an unsaved person who has never been inside a church, has no Christian relatives, and has never opened a Bible. Think of how surreal our Christmas traditions might appear. Think of how confusing that person will find your church's Christmas cantata. Will your Christmas card or Christmas carols make sense? Ox and ass before him bow, and he is in the manger now. What's that all about? And finally, think of how your Christmas traditions will be so at odds with that person's secular humanist education. We should never feel ashamed of genuine biblical truth, nor be intimidated into rejecting the real historical record. But neither should we feel obligated to defend error, even when it's wrapped in the warm fuzziness of tradition or the cloak of religion. We must prioritize and communicate biblical truth, accurately and without addition, to the unsaved. This is the source of true saving power. When we clutter up the picture with myths and legends, we do far more harm than good. With post-Christian values being the norm today, we must base our approach on this principle. What we once could excuse in a Christian culture is now no longer viable. Secondly, we must consider our rising generation. I realize that I'm challenging a sacred cow when I discuss children and Christmas traditions. Nevertheless, this topic is important enough to risk a lynching by angry parents, and even more so, angry grandparents. Our children are a sacred trust. As parents and grandparents, our top priority is conveying an accurate picture of the Scriptures. We must neither add nor take away from the biblical account. We ultimately do little good to fill our children's heads with error that will have to come out later, possibly painfully. And I'm not talking about Santa Claus. In reality, Santa Claus poses far less of a problem than erroneous Christian beliefs. After all, how many people have trouble letting go of Old Saint Nick? Yet numerous adults retain erroneous Christian traditions throughout their lives. Others use them as a justification for rejecting biblical truth as they become adults. Okay, I've laid the groundwork, so let's get going. First, we'll examine some history, and then we'll look at what the Bible really says about Christmas. Rather interestingly, the early church did not celebrate Christmas. The New Testament does not specify any equivalents of the Old Testament feasts. Indeed, the only events it specifically mandates are the Lord's Supper and baptism. We usually refer to these as ordinances or institutes. There are no official church feasts or celebrations. On the other hand, as Romans chapter 14 verses 5 and 6 indicates, the New Testament does allow some freedom for individuals and local congregations to decide how and when they worship. One person values one day over another. Another values every day the same. Each person must be fully convinced in his own mind. The one who observes the day observes it for the Lord, and the one who eats does so with regard to the Lord, for he gives thanks to God. And the one who does not eat, it is for the Lord that he does not eat, and he gives thanks to God. The principle of Christian liberty, by extension, can apply to religious holidays and observances. But we must remember that the New Testament emphasizes that all Christian practices must be biblically based and doctrinally accurate. Regrettably, the Church failed to follow this rule when it exercised its Christian liberty in the centuries following the Apostolic Age. As replacement theology worked its way into the Church, what we now call the religious or liturgical year emerged. This supplied the Church with its own feast cycle and helped it to maintain the illusion that it had replaced Israel and inherited that nation's promises. Does this mean that I see Christmas as inappropriate for the church age? Not at all. God prophesied, documented, and used Christ's first coming, or Advent, to move history forward on the path to the kingdom. Without the first Advent, redemption would never have happened. So yes, I do believe that Christians should recognize Christmas and celebrate it in biblically consistent ways. Significantly, the early church emphasized the resurrection more than the nativity. It also focused strongly upon the second advent, Christ's return to the earth, first to catch up believers in the rapture, and secondly to establish the millennial kingdom after the tribulation. The very language outlining the procedure for the Lord's Supper emphasizes this idea. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. When the church began to celebrate the Incarnation, it was not a single event. Rather, the church of late antiquity celebrated Epiphany, which originated in what we now call the Eastern Church. Church leaders, among them John Chrysostom, began to mention Epiphany around AD 360. Originally, Epiphany celebrated Christ's baptism, not his birth. Over time, however, the Church, particularly in the West, expanded the feast to include the Nativity, the visit of the Magi, Jesus' childhood, and his baptism. Today, those Western churches that celebrate Epiphany, which comes during the first week of January, narrow it to focus on the visit of the Magi alone. The 12 days of Christmas, famously celebrated in that rather endless song, refers to the days between Christmas and January 5th. Those of the Eastern Orthodox tradition, of course, have their own version of Epiphany. Placing Christ's birth in December is almost certainly inaccurate. The Bible gives no clear date for this event, unlike Israel's feasts, because the New Testament doesn't specify Christmas as a formal observance. Indeed, it's far more likely that Jesus was born either in the spring or the autumn, since these times fit with the shepherds being out in the fields at night. Historians do not know for certain why Christmas came to be celebrated in late December. Many theorize that December 25th comes close to the winter solstice, which almost all ancient cultures observed. The symbolism associated with the return of the sun must have been compelling to many. In the late 4th century, Augustine linked the Nativity and the solstice's symbolism together, affirming late December as an appropriate time to celebrate. Many point out that Christmas is probably a fusion of Christian practice with popular pagan beliefs, something we call syncretism. As history demonstrates, the Church used syncretism over and over to its detriment as it attempted to win over non-Christian cultures. Certainly, a number of pagan festivals do fall around the time of the winter solstice. The Roman Saturnalia, a jolly time by all accounts, is one such example. Germanic and Scandinavian solstice holidays include Yule, a ritual involving sacrifice and fertility. Many traditional Christmas symbols such as greenery, holly, trees, and mistletoe have pagan symbolic significance. It's likely that the Church decided to syncretize these into symbols of resurrection and regeneration rather than trying to remove them altogether. Today, with great distance between us and the original meanings, the problem is less significant. However, it remains as a warning that the principle of syncretism is bad and unbiblical. As late antiquity transitioned into the early Middle Ages, more and more traditions entered Christmas. Let me hasten to add that not all of these are bad, but many clouded and obscured the true biblical account with nonsensical mythology and legend. Over the centuries, those in the so-called Christian world, largely deprived of the Bible, grew to have no idea what was true and what was just human invention. Let's take a look at a few of these additions. The term Christmas first appeared in the 11th century. It came from the words Christ's Mass and referred to the Roman Catholic Church's practice of celebrating the Mass, or Eucharist, to commemorate the Nativity. If you've ever watched the Pope celebrate midnight Mass at Christmas, you're seeing the modern equivalent of this medieval ritual. You've probably seen the word Christmas abbreviated as Xmas. Many Christians find this offensive, believing it to be a secular or atheistic attempt to delete Christ from the holiday. Unfortunately, this is faulty history. The abbreviation goes back to the 1500s and very definitely includes Christ in the word. The X is actually the Greek letter chi, which looks like an X. The Greek word Christos begins with a chi, so the X is simply the first letter in our word Christ. If we were to abbreviate the word Christmas today in this way, we would write it CMass. Since it bothers many Christians, it's probably best not to use it. But I would recommend telling Christians the true history of the abbreviation so they don't continue to spread this particular misconception. Many apparently harmless additions that shape our modern nativity scenes come from an apocryphal book called Pseudo-Matthew, which was written in the 7th century. The writer of this definitely non-canonical book wanted to fill in the rather thin biblical account of Jesus' childhood, and so fabricated a whole mythology. In this book, we learn all about Jesus' grandparents, his mother Mary's childhood and adolescence, as well as plenty of extra things about his birth. The ox and ass sung about in Good Christian Men Rejoice entered the stable in Pseudo-Matthew. And incidentally, there is no scriptural basis for any animals bowing before the infant Jesus. Compelling as that image is to some, it's pure nonsense. Speaking of nativity scenes, Francis of Assisi introduced them to the Church in the 10th century as a visual teaching tool. We've enjoyed them ever since. I have no trouble with them, although most are highly inaccurate. So just to set the record straight, let's edit out the problems. To begin with, we don't know for sure that Jesus was born in a stable. It's a reasonable assumption given that the Bible tells us that Mary placed him in a manger. But it could have been a cave or other structure. We have no idea what kind of animals used it. But I'll be nice and keep calling it a stable since there's no compelling reason not to. According to the biblical account, only Joseph, Mary, baby Jesus, and the shepherds are allowed in the stable. The wise men, or magi, never went to the stable. Sorry, but it's true. The shepherds didn't bring any lambs. According to the biblical account, they left their sheep and came to the stable. So dismiss any sacrifice imagery. It doesn't belong here. While the Magi saw the star in the east, the Bible says nothing about it shining over the stable at Jesus' birth. Indeed, there is no support at all for its being noticed in Israel. It appeared a year or two later to guide the Magi to the house where Jesus was staying, but it never appeared over the stable. The Bible doesn't say how many Magi came. They certainly gave 3 gifts, but that doesn't mean that there were 3 of them. Alas, we don't know their names, despite the churches traditionally telling us that they were Balthazar, Caspar, and Melchior. Returning to the stable, as far as we know, the newborn Jesus did what all babies did: slept or cried when the shepherds came. He didn't do anything unbabylike, such as smiling or blessing people. These ideas do not come from the Bible, but from a collection of apocryphal books known collectively as the Infancy Gospels. Like Pseudo-Matthew, their writers felt that the biblical account was too brief, and so helped God out by filling in the blanks. Perhaps you've noticed that religious art almost always portrays Joseph as an old man standing rather creakily in the background. The Bible doesn't give us his age, but there's no reason to assume that he was old. It's more likely that he was in his 30s rather than his 60s or 70s. Given his relative poverty, he probably had to wait to marry until he had established himself in his craft. But many men of his station in life managed to achieve this by their 30s. So why the elderly Joseph? This goes back to a false notion that the church perpetuated, the idea that Mary continued a perpetual virgin after Jesus' birth. Clearly, an older, non-virile Joseph fits this teaching better than a vigorous man in his prime. But we can shoot down this false doctrine quite easily by reading Mark, chronologically the first gospel written. Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James, Joses, Judas, and Simon? And are his sisters not here with us? I'll conclude my myth-busting with a fun fact. Christmas carols first appeared in the 4th century, right around the time that the church began to celebrate Epiphany. We've enjoyed them ever since. Despite my Scrooge-like, curmudgeonly attitude, I think they can play a worthwhile role in Christmas celebrations. But the historian in me reminds us all to critique what they proclaim with a Berean-like love of the true biblical account. With that segue, let's move into the hard facts of Christmas by looking at that biblical account. As you probably know, Matthew and Luke both provide us with the key events of the first Advent. Of course, many Old Testament prophecies set the stage for these events. If you're not familiar with the biblical accounts, read Matthew chapter 1 and 2 and Luke chapter 1 and 2. You may be surprised to see that they differ considerably, each mentioning events that the other omits. Why this difference? Simply because God used each gospel to reach a different audience. Matthew, for example, targets the Jewish people. In the 1st century, this book reached out to the undecided of Israel, explaining that Jesus was indeed their Messiah. I believe that it's also a buried time capsule for the Jewish people to discover during the tribulation. For these reasons, it focuses upon the history of Jesus' messiahship. Luke, on the other hand, wrote his gospel a bit later, focusing upon the history of the transition period when both Israel and the church ran side by side dispensationally. Consequently, his gospel and its companion, the book of Acts, tend to be more pure history, providing the facts needed to understand the 1st century. As historians, therefore, we can assemble a complete narrative of the Nativity by examining both books and sequencing the information they provide. This is what I'll do right now, offering you my synthesis. We'll look at everything in chronological order. Here we go. Zacharias receives the promise of a son, John the Baptist, via the angel Gabriel. He's struck mute as a sign. About 6 months later, Mary receives a promise, also via Gabriel, that she will be the mother of the Messiah. Mary stays for about 3 months with Elizabeth and Zacharias. The embryo John the Baptist acknowledges Christ's presence, Elizabeth prophesies, and Mary praises the Lord. Mary returns home to Nazareth, about 3 months pregnant. Joseph learns of Mary's pregnancy and plans to divorce her on the grounds of infidelity. Joseph receives an angelic assurance of Mary's purity and is commanded to take her as his wife. Joseph takes Mary as his wife but does not consummate the marriage until after she gives birth to Jesus. Elizabeth gives birth to John. Zacharias regains his speech and prophesies of John's future ministry as the forerunner and Elijah figure. The Roman government proclaims a census. Joseph and Mary travel to Bethlehem to register. No mention of a donkey, by the way. Jesus is born while Joseph and Mary are in Bethlehem, fulfilling Old Testament prophecy. Since the inn was full, this event happened in some type of animal shelter. The shepherds receive an angelic invitation to visit the infant Jesus. This event happens at night. They visit the stable without accompanying sheep. We don't know much about what happens other than that the shepherds praised God and Mary reflected on these events. The star appears in the east. The Magi recognize its significance. They prepare to journey to Israel. Jesus is circumcised 8 days after birth, per the instructions of Leviticus 12. The Bible does not specify where this happened. 33 days after his circumcision, Jesus is taken by his parents to Jerusalem to be presented at the temple in accordance with the law. Joseph and Mary offer a bird sacrifice which was appropriate for poorer people. Note that this event is separate from Jesus' circumcision. Simeon and Anna, two watchfully waiting Old Testament righteous, see the infant Jesus, praising God and prophesying. About 42 days after Jesus' birth, Joseph and Mary return to Nazareth, their census and Mosaic law responsibilities fulfilled. Between 1 and 2 years after this event, Joseph and Mary return to Bethlehem, probably to celebrate one of the pilgrimage feasts, which we know that Joseph, a devout man, observed. Presumably they did this regularly, although the scriptures provide no specifics. The Magi arrive in Jerusalem during this time and inquire about the Messiah. Herod the Great is disturbed and consults the religious leaders who identify Bethlehem as the Messiah's birthplace. Herod sends the Magi to Bethlehem with an insincere and sinister request. The Magi travel to nearby Bethlehem, see the star, which does not behave like an ordinary star, and find the house where Joseph, Mary, and Jesus were staying. The Magi worship the Christ and present symbolic gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. They return home, bypassing Jerusalem and Herod as the result of a warning dream. An angel warns Joseph through another dream to flee to Egypt. He departs immediately, not even waiting for day. Herod orders all the male children of Bethlehem under 2 years old to be killed. This was a typical Herodian action consistent with the man's historical behavior. Given the likely population, this event, while horrific and depraved, probably involved no more than a few dozen infants. Herod dies, and his son, Herod Archelaus, assumes power. Joseph returns to Israel but avoids Judea, going straight to Nazareth in Galilee. All instructions come through dreams. Jesus grows up in Nazareth. We know absolutely nothing about his childhood up to the age of 12. Joseph and Mary have at least 6 children, indicating a properly consummated marriage. We learn about one of Joseph and Mary's pilgrimage feast journeys to Jerusalem that occurred when Jesus was about 12 years old. On this occasion, he makes an appearance in the temple, impressing and confusing the religious leaders with his questions and comments. He returns to Nazareth. He becomes a carpenter, which is consistent with his station in life and his father's craft. We know nothing further about him until he is around 30 years old. Meanwhile, Jesus' relative, John the Baptist, grows up in the wilderness and becomes a very Elijah-like person, the greatest and last of all Old Testament prophets. Joseph dies sometime during this period. All we know is that he isn't present when Jesus begins his ministry. John the Baptist begins his ministry as the forerunner of the Messiah. Around the age of 30, Jesus begins his ministry by being baptized by John. And those are all the facts we have. While history can add some illuminating contextual detail, anything else does nothing but build a mythology, something not pleasing to God. So we'll leave it there. Let me conclude 2020 by wishing you and your family a very merry, as well as biblically and historically accurate Christmas. Present Perfect is a copyright of Don Congdon. Music is copyright Footage Firm Incorporated. Scripture quotations are from the New American Standard Bible, which is a copyright of the Lockman Foundation. This podcast is available on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Stitcher. Just search for Present Perfect Church History.